Today's Chitas, Tanya, for the 30th of Sivan, is in Perek Tes, chapter 9 of Shara Yichud V'Emunah. It's at the top of the page, Pei Zayin Amud Aleph. The number on the bottom of the page is 330. The Alter Rebbe is saying that this contradiction, that on the one hand, God is infinitely removed from the attributes, and at the same time, He is one with these attributes. This contradiction is something that is known only to the Maskilim, to those who study Kabbalah. We see from here, incidentally, that Hasidus is not an explanation for Kabbalah. Some people think that Hasidus is a commentary on Kabbalah, comes to explain Kabbalah. Actually, the teachings of Hasidus is an individual and separate part of Torah, just as Kabbalah is. Hasidus is its own dimension of Torah. And although Hasidus uses Kabbalah to explain certain concepts, but it is not there to explain Kabbalah. And that's why we find that there are statements in the Tanya where the Alter Rebbe says what that is and how that is. That's Kabbalistic. That's known to Kabbalah. And he doesn't explain it, although it's actually explained to some degree in other places in Hasidus. But the point is that Hasidus, Tanya, is not here to explain Kabbalah. Kabbalah basically explains what's happening in heaven. Hasidus wants to understand what is happening on earth. What is this world all about? And that's why the devotion of Hasidus is to explain the higher level unity and the lower level unity. How the world is really not what it appears to be, but is actually one with God. At any rate, this contradiction, when we say on the one hand that God is infinitely removed from all of His attributes, and on the other hand we say that He is one with His attributes, and that's why in knowing the world, He's not adding any knowledge, He's not increasing in knowledge, because He knows the world by knowing Himself, because His knowledge and Him are one. So on this, there's a note, a Hagah, at the top of the page, where the Alter Rebbe writes that this mystery of how the attributes of God are one with Him, even though He is infinitely removed from them, is based on the principle of Tzimtzum, or the secret of Tzimtzum. And that is the Tzimtzum Be'erein Seif Baruch Hu, the contraction of God's infinite light, the Tzimtzum Ak, Adam Kadmein, and then a second Tzimtzum, where God invests Himself into the original thought of creation, which is referred to as Adam Kadmein, and then a third Tzimtzum, the Seid HaDikna. Dikna means the hair on the face, the beard. The hair is a greater Tzimtzum because there's so little life in the hair to where you don't even feel pain when you cut it. So it's a very limited amount of life. So all of these contractions and these Tzimtzumim, the purpose of all of them is Letzamtzim ha'ei sheyislabish v'bechinas kelim diyut sviris. In order to get the light, which is unrestrained, which is a neutral light that has no properties at all, in order to get them to take on the properties of the various attributes, they have to be clothed in the kelim, in the vessels of the 10 attributes. In other words, the attribute itself, Chachma, for example, the fact that it is Chachma, wisdom, that it is intelligence and not emotions, that itself is the vessel into which the light, the infinite light of God, is contracted, so that you have the living attribute of Chachma or of Bina and so on. So that the light of God, the infinite light, is clothed in those attributes. It's only after the Erein Seif is clothed in the vessels, in the kelim of Chachma, Bina, Das, only then does it apply that which the Rambam says, that God is the knower and the knowing, and the knowledge all at the same time, and that he knows by knowing himself. All of these things apply only to the godliness that is contained within the vessels or within the attributes of Atzilus. And through this he knows all worlds, because since these attributes of Atzilus become the neshama and the life source of the lower worlds and all that is in them, so the knowledge of God in Atzilus also applies to all other levels. And so God knows all there is by knowing himself, within himself. But without this tzimtzum, and without this clothing of the light of God into these attributes, then it would be totally inappropriate to say that God is the knower and the knowing. All of this would be irrelevant and out of place to ascribe to God. Because God is not at all in the category of das and knowledge. But rather higher, much higher, infinitely removed. Even not only from Chachma itself, but even from the realm of Chachma. In other words, you can say, for example, that there are levels of Chachma. There's a higher Chachma, a lower Chachma, a deeper Chachma. And then there is the realm of Chachma. The very fact that Chachma is what it is, and not something else, that Chachma is Chachma and it's not Chesed, that itself, the realm of Chachma, is infinitely lower than God. So it's not just a question of how high the Chachma is, how low the Chachma is. The whole notion of Chachma, that God is in any way connected to a recognizable or definable entity, such as Chachma, regardless of how high the Chachma is. It is Chachma, not something else. Then it's not appropriate to apply to God. To the point where Chachma is to God equal in its insignificance to a physical act. The highest level of Chachma in the most highest and most spiritual world is to God as insignificant and as far removed from him as a physical act in this world. Now back to the text. V'hinei ein lanu esek b'nestoreis. We have no need for the hidden things, those things that were mentioned before. This mystery of how the attributes are one with God, and yet God is much higher than them, infinitely removed from them. So we have no need for these mysteries. Achanigles lanu, but that which is revealed to us, that which we know concerning how we approach this subject, is laha min emunah shleima, to believe with a total faith, the ihu v'garmehu chad, that he and his attributes are one. Which means God's attributes, his will, his wisdom, his bina, his das, is one with him himself. It is one with God, who himself is infinitely removed from Chachma v'Seichel v'Hasaga. So we have to believe this with a perfect faith, that this is the case, that God is one with his attributes. And therefore, this oneness that God has with his attributes, the attributes that come from him, this oneness is also beyond understanding. To understand how God is united with them, and that's why God's attributes, which are the 10 divine attributes, are called B'Zeir HaKodesh. In the Zeir they are referred to as Rozo Dimehem as the notion of faith, the secret of faith. because they are to be understood on faith. Shehi ha'emunah shelamayla me'aseichel, which is emunah that is above seichel. That which we can't comprehend with intelligence has to be accepted, has to be treated and handled with emunah. So, these attributes with which God creates the world are one with Him. Earlier, when the Alter Rebbe was explaining how the world is nothing separate from God, he doesn't say that the world is one with God. He says that the world is non-existent. The physical condition has no existence of its own. There is nothing to it at all. It is only an appearance. It's an illusion. It seems to have an appearance of its own. But in fact, it is nothing at all and has absolutely no significance relative to God. But it doesn't say that all the physical existence and all the physical objects are one with God. Here, in describing the oneness between God and His attributes, He doesn't say that the attributes are nothing, insignificant, non-existent. On the contrary, He says they are one with Him. What is the difference between saying that something is non-existent and therefore there's nothing besides Him, or saying that something is one with Him and again, therefore there's nothing besides Him? One of the ways of explaining the difference is the difference between a mitzvah and that which we do l'shem shamayim. When we do something l'shem shamayim, when we're told that all that we do should be for the sake of heaven, for example, eating or making a living, it should all be for the sake of heaven. What that means is that the act of eating or the food itself is so insignificant, it is so much beside the point. It is not the objective at all. It is not an end at all. It is merely a means to an end. And a means to an end is totally non-significant and non-existent relative to the end itself. In the simple example of saying that a person who's on his way to shul cannot be described as walking the streets. He's not walking the streets. He is going to shul. The fact that he has to go through the street in order to get to the shul is totally insignificant. And so, there aren't two activities. It's not that he's walking the streets and he's going to shul. He is only going to shul. That's all he's doing. The fact that he's walking through the streets is totally insignificant. So there aren't two things, there's only one thing. When a person eats l'shem shamayim, he's eating because he needs the strength to serve God. He's eating because he wants to get on with serving God. He wants to get back to serving God. Only the physical condition demands that he has to stop and eat. So the only way to get to serving God is through eating, by first eating. So he eats. But what he's doing is actually serving God. The act of eating loses itself and becomes totally insignificant because it is not the objective. The person is not concerned with the eating. He is concerned with serving God. And the eating is like walking through the streets to get to the shul. And as a result, when he eats l'shem shamayim, he's not picky about his food. He's not concerned so much with the taste and the texture and the smell. He's concerned only with eating it so that he can get on to the more important thing. Not only more important, to the only thing that counts. Because the eating doesn't count at all. And so, the person has only one devotion. He has only one commitment, and that is to serving God. He has no minor commitment to eating. He has no secondary devotion to eating. The eating is totally insignificant and non-existent as an end in itself or as a purpose in itself, not even as a secondary purpose or insignificant purpose. It has no significance at all. On the other hand, when it comes to doing a mitzvah, we don't say that the details of the mitzvah are insignificant and incidental to the act of the mitzvah itself. This is not so. The details of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. The detail is the essence. The detail is the end, not a means to an end. So the fact that a person puts on tefillin and the tefillin have 4 chapters in it, 4 scrolls. The fact that there are 4 scrolls there is not an incidental and preliminary act to the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to have 4 scrolls on your head and on your arm. That's God's will. It's not an incidental thing. It's not a way to get to what God wants. It is what God wants. It is one with God. So it's not that God wants you to wear tefillin, and the only way to get to the tefillin is by having them square, and having them black, and having them have 4 chapters. The 4 chapters, and the squareness, and the blackness, that is God's will. That is essentially what He is, what God is. He is one with those mitzvahs. So when we say that there is nothing besides God, what about Torah and mitzvahs? There's God, and then there's Torah, and then there are mitzvahs. But the fact is that Torah and mitzvahs are one with God, and therefore, again, there is nothing besides God. Only in this case, there is nothing besides God, because the detail of the mitzvah is nothing other than Him, is one with Him. There's nothing besides God, because the world, the physical condition, the finite condition, isn't anything at all. It is totally insignificant, of no significance, and therefore there is nothing besides God. In the Hayom Yom, for the 30th day of Sivan, which is a Chodesh, the Rebbe writes in the Hayom Yom that when we Maver Sedra, when we go over the Parsha on Friday, and we read the Pasuk twice and the Targum once, we do it Pasuk by Pasuk. You read the Pasuk and then the Targum, then the Pasuk, then the Targum. Also, we read the Haftarah, or in case there are 2 Haftarahs, as for example, it's Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, or we read 2 Parshas of the same Shabbos, and each one has a Haftarah, then we read both Haftarahs as well. The Alter Rebbe's response to a young man who was a genius and famous for his gifts and talents when he came into Yechidus for the first time. And this was in the year Tov Kuf Nun Hey, in 1795 in Lozhna. So the Alter Rebbe said to him that spiritual and the physical are opposites in their very essence. A superior quality in the physical, that which is of virtue in the physical, is a deficiency in the spiritual. How do we see this? In material matters, there is a virtue of being satisfied with your lot. A person who is content with what he has, that's a virtue. That is a person of the highest quality. But a person possessing the same attitude towards spiritual matters, to be content, to be satisfied with one's lot concerning the spiritual growth, this is not a virtue at all. This leads, God forbid, to a great descent and to falling in the spiritual things. So a person who has the trait, this attribute of being content with his lot in the physical matters and material matters, he, through his efforts on Aveda, will reach the highest levels. But a person who is content with his spiritual condition will fall to the lowest levels.